The house did not announce danger. It rose calmly from the flat land of Northern California, symmetrical, pale, almost gentle in the afternoon light. From a distance, Bidwell Mansion looked less like a fortress of power and more like a promise that civilization had finally arrived, that order could be imposed on dust, heat, and distance. The trees around it were planted deliberately, their shadows rehearsed decades in advance. The walls held the confidence of a century that believed permanence was a decision, not a gamble. Inside, air moved differently. Thick walls slowed sound, footsteps softened. Time itself seemed padded, as if the house absorbed urgency and returned only quiet. But this calm was expensive. It depended on constant attention, unseen hands polishing wood, replacing fabric, tightening joints that expanded and contracted with each season. Nothing here lasted on its own. Everything endured because someone noticed decay early enough. The problem was that most of those people were never seen. The mansion's elegance distracted from the system beneath it. Pipes hidden in walls never designed for modern pressure. Electrical lines added long after the original structure had settled. Materials chosen for beauty rather than resistance. What looked solid was, in truth, carefully balanced. A Victorian body carrying 20th century organs. And balance, as history tends to prove, is temporary. Visitors walked through rooms as if they were stepping backward into certainty. Guides spoke of pioneers, vision, optimism, but no one lingered on the costs of keeping a 19th century mansion alive in a state that now burned every summer. No one mentioned how maintenance budgets quietly grew faster than public patience, or how each added safety measure introduced new stress to an already aging structure. The house survived by adaptation, but adaptation has limits. And then the climate shifted, not abruptly, not in a way that demanded immediate action, just enough that summers grew longer, drier, just enough that fire stopped being an exception and became a season. The mansion remained still, unchanged, assuming the world would continue to respect its present, assuming history was a shield. But the rules were already changing, and the question no one wanted to ask was whether a house built to symbolize arrival could survive an era defined by loss. The house had always depended on rhythm, not the rhythm visitors noticed, the slow walk through parlors, the careful pauses near portraits, but the operational rhythm underneath. Inspections, repairs, small interventions done just early enough to prevent something worse. The kind of work that never makes history books, yet quietly holds history together. By the early 21st century, that rhythm was under strain. Bidwell Mansion was no longer a private residence, absorbing costs through land, labor, and political favor. It was a public artifact, which meant every repair required approval, funding cycles, paperwork, justification. What once could be fixed in a week now waited months, sometimes years, and time, inside an old structure, is never neutral. The mansion's systems were layered like sediment. Original wooden beams carried loads they were never meant to carry for this long. Electrical wiring had been threaded through spaces never designed to hold heat. Fire suppression systems, added late, relied on water pressure that fluctuated with municipal demand. Each solution solved one problem while quietly amplifying another. It worked, but only as long as nothing went wrong all at once. The staff knew this. They walked the halls before opening hours, listening more than looking. A faint hum where silence used to be. A smell that didn't belong. Doors that stuck differently in summer than in winter. None of it dramatic. All of it cumulative. Maintenance logs grew thicker, but budgets did not. Every year became a negotiation between what was ideal and what was survivable. Outside, California was changing faster than institutions could adapt. Fire was no longer an event. It was infrastructure. Counties adjusted emergency plans. Insurance market hardened. Power companies shut down lines preemptively. Yet historic buildings lived in a regulatory gray zone, protected from alteration, but increasingly exposed to modern risk. The mansion could not easily be retrofitted without compromising the very authenticity that justified its existence. And so, compromises accumulated, deferred upgrades, temporary fixes that became permanent. assumptions that tomorrow would resemble yesterday closely enough to manage. The mansion had survived earthquakes, economic depression, wars. That record bred confidence. Confidence can be useful. It can also delay necessary fear. What few visitors realized was how narrow the margins had become. A single malfunction now had consequences far beyond a broken room. Fire spread faster in structures filled with dry, century-old wood. Smoke moved differently through high ceilings and enclosed staircases. Evacuation plans assumed early detection, an assumption that depended entirely on systems that were themselves aging. Yet on the surface, nothing appeared urgent. Tours continued. Photographs were taken. The mansion performed its role flawlessly, a stable symbol in an unstable time. It reassured by existing. It suggested that endurance was simply a matter of care and respect. But endurance also depends on luck, and luck is not evenly distributed. When conditions align, heat, dryness, a moment of inattention, history can compress into minutes. Institutions that measure time in decades are rarely prepared for events that unfold faster than decision-making processes. The mansion stood ready for visitors, but not for chaos. What failed first would later be debated. A system, a response, a moment. No single cause would feel sufficient, because no single cause ever is. What mattered was that the structure had reached a point where it could no longer absorb surprise. And once surprise enters an old building, it does not negotiate. The house had survived by adaptation for more than a century. But adaptation assumes time, and time, very soon, would no longer be available. The night did not arrive suddenly. It crept in, the way danger often does in California, with warm air that refused to cool, with a stillness that felt earned rather than ominous. The mansion sat quietly, its windows dark, its presence unchanged. There was no alarm in its silhouette, no visible warning that the balance it relied on had finally tipped. Fire does not respect symbolism. It does not slow down for historical designation or public memory. When it begins, it moves according to physics alone. Heat seeking fuel, oxygen feeding expansion, structure determining speed. Old buildings offer generous invitation, dry wood, hidden cavities, long corridors that act like lungs. What had once been architectural elegance becomes acceleration. Inside, spaces that had been designed for ceremony responded badly to urgency. Staircases that guided guests gracefully upward now pulled heat vertically, faster than any human could move. High ceilings trapped smoke before releasing it in sudden, disorienting waves. Rooms meant to impress absorbed fire differently, depending on what had been preserved and what had been replaced. Nothing burned evenly, nothing failed in isolation. The first moments were not cinematic. They were procedural. Calls made, protocols activated, firefighters approaching with expectations shaped by ordinary structures, only to find a building that behaved like something older, less predictable. Water met surfaces that had not been exposed to that volume or pressure in generations. Some materials resisted briefly, others collapsed without warning. Fire found paths that no modern blueprint fully captured. From the outside, observers saw something they had never imagined seeing: a house that had represented arrival, settlement, control, order, now defined by vulnerability. Flames reframed its outline, turning familiarity into shock. The mansion was still recognizable, but only barely. Its authority dissolved in real time, and yet, even then, the assumption lingered that it could be saved, that damage would be contained, that restoration, expensive but possible, would follow. Institutions are trained to think in recovery terms. Loss is always framed as partial until proven otherwise. But fire does not leave room for incremental failure. It decides quickly whether something remains or becomes memory. Inside, the infrastructure gave up in stages. Systems failed not because they were neglected, but because they were never meant to endure this kind of stress simultaneously. Electrical lines shorted. Support beams weakened faster than eyes could register. Spaces that had been safe minutes earlier became unreachable. The building crossed a threshold beyond which human intention no longer mattered. What burned was not just wood and fabric. It was accumulated labor, decisions made decades apart suddenly colliding, money saved in one era becoming vulnerability in another, preservation choices, once praised for restraint, now limiting intervention. Every compromise the mansion had carried quietly was being called due, all at once. For those watching, time warped. Minutes felt too fast. Hours felt unreal. The structure did not fall dramatically. It surrendered unevenly. Some sections resisted stubbornly, as if refusing to accept the new reality. Others vanished almost politely. There was no single moment to point to and say, "This is when it was gone." By morning, what remained was quieter than expected. Not ash alone, but absence. The outline still existed, but the meaning had shifted. The mansion was no longer a place one entered. It was a site one circled. Conversations changed tone. Words like damage gave way to loss, then to what now? The fire had not targeted the Bidwell Mansion specifically. It had simply exposed the fragility of systems designed for another century. What burned was a lesson that had been forming slowly for years, that preservation without transformation is a gamble, and that history, when left standing, continues to demand payment. The question that followed was not whether the fire could have been prevented. That debate would stretch on. The deeper question was harder, whether keeping the mansion exactly as it was had ever truly been possible in a world that no longer resembled the one it was built for. Because once a symbol of permanence burns, what remains is not just grief, it is reckoning. After the fire, certainty did not collapse. It fragmented. There was no single narrative that could contain what had happened. Investigations began immediately, moving along parallel track that rarely intersected. Structural engineers focused on stress points. Preservationists spoke in the language of irreplaceability. Administrators spoke carefully, aware that every word might later be used to assign blame or absolution. The mansion, even damaged, was still exerting control over those around it. What surprised many was how quickly the conversation shifted from loss to cost. Not emotional cost, that was assumed, but financial gravity. Stabilization alone demanded resources that exceeded what many small towns allocate to essential services in a year. Restoration, if attempted, would require not just money, but time measured in political cycles rather than seasons. Each delay introduced new decay. Each intervention risked altering the very thing it sought to preserve. The structure itself resisted simple conclusions. Some elements survived better than expected. Others, once thought robust, failed completely. Fire had exposed the internal logic of the building, which choices had aged well, and which had quietly become liabilities. The mansion was now a document, not of its construction, but of its maintenance history. Every shortcut and every careful repair left a visible trace. Outside experts arrived with confidence shaped by precedent. Historic fires had been followed by rebuilds before, but Bidwell Mansion occupied an awkward category, too significant to abandon easily, too fragile to modernize freely, too expensive to rebuild exactly as it had been. The building existed in a narrow corridor where intention, legality, and feasibility rarely aligned. Public opinion did not settle quickly. Some argued that loss was final, that the fire had concluded the mansion's story as decisively as any closing chapter. Others insisted that restoration was an obligation, not to the past itself, but to the idea that history could be protected from erasure. Both sides spoke with conviction. Neither fully addressed the operational reality. What had burned was not just architecture. It was the assumption that symbols could be frozen in time while the world accelerated around them. The mansion had survived by being exceptional, but climate, economics, and governance were now operating at scales that did not respect exception. Fire seasons extended, insurance models recalculated risk, public patience with expensive preservation narrowed as other needs pressed harder. Behind closed doors, questions became sharper. If restored, how would the mansion be protected differently? What compromises would be acceptable now that purity had proven dangerous? Would authenticity be preserved through replication, or would replication itself undermine the point? Each answer closed one door and opened another. There was no version of the future that did not involve loss, only different arrangements of it. The building's absence began to change behavior. Visitors stopped coming. Guides found themselves narrating around fences. Memory replaced experience. Photographs gained authority. What the mansion had been became increasingly mediated, increasingly abstract. In some ways, the house became more powerful after the fire. No longer constrained by physical presence, it existed as an argument. Yet arguments do not house. They do not require heating, wiring, inspections. They do not burn. The practical burden had shifted entirely onto decision-makers who inherited a problem without a clean solution. To rebuild was to accept ongoing cost in an even more volatile future. To let go was to admit that preservation has boundaries, a statement institutions rarely make willingly. The mansion had once symbolized arrival, the confidence of a society that believed it could root itself permanently. Now it symbolized something quieter and more uncomfortable, that permanence is negotiated repeatedly and sometimes denied. The fire had not destroyed history. It had forced it into a different form. What remained unresolved was not whether the Bidwell Mansion could be restored. It was whether restoring it would mean repeating the same assumption that had already failed. Because the next chapter would not be written by fire, it would be written by choice. The mansion still exists, just not in the way it once did. Its presence has shifted from physical mass to moral weight. What stands now is not a building, but a dilemma that refuses to age quietly. Every discussion about Bidwell Mansion circles the same tension, whether history is something we hold or something that holds us. In retrospect, the warning signs appear almost obvious. A house designed to project stability was increasingly dependent on fragile systems. A symbol meant to represent arrival was being asked to survive acceleration. The cost of keeping it unchanged grew faster than the willingness to confront what unchanged really meant. But clarity only arrives after collapse. Before that, everything feels manageable until it isn't. What the fire revealed was not negligence in the simple sense. It revealed accumulation, decisions layered over decades, each reasonable in isolation, forming a structure that could no longer bend without breaking. Preservation had become an act of faith, faith that tomorrow would resemble yesterday closely enough to justify restraint. That faith had gone unexamined for too long. The tragedy was not that the mansion burned. The tragedy was that it burned while still performing its role convincingly, while it reassured, while it implied that care and respect were enough, while it suggested that the past could be protected without being fundamentally renegotiated. The fire did not interrupt a decline. It punctured an illusion. Afterward, the language surrounding the mansion changed. Words like legacy and heritage began sharing space with risk and liability. These were not cynical intrusions. They were overdue reality. History, when preserved, becomes infrastructure, and infrastructure demands constant recalibration as conditions change. Sentiment alone cannot carry that weight. What makes the Bidwell Mansion story uncomfortable is that it offers no villain, no single failure, no moment where everything clearly went wrong. Instead, it presents a system that worked until it didn't. A system optimized for stability in a world that stopped being stable. The house did what it was designed to do. The world changed around it. In that sense, the mansion's fate is not unique. Across regions shaped by fire, flood, heat, and scarcity, institutions are discovering that preservation without transformation is not neutrality. It is a choice with consequences. Every decision to delay adaptation is a decision to absorb greater risk later. And risk, eventually, collects payment. What remains is a quieter lesson. Not about fire, but about time. About how power once expressed through permanence must now express itself through flexibility. About how honoring the past may require altering the forms that once embodied it. The mansion stood as long as it could under the assumptions it inherited. When those assumptions expired, the structure followed. The site may one day be rebuilt, or it may remain partially absent, marked more by memory than by walls. Either outcome will be framed as intentional, as meaningful. But beneath the narrative, the cost will continue: financial, environmental, Moral: the fire did not end the story. It clarified its stakes. The house once declared that arrival was possible, that order could be imposed, that permanence could be designed. What it declares now is something more fragile and more honest, that endurance is conditional, that history survives only through constant negotiation, and that beauty, when left standing, is never free. The mansion is no longer asking to be admired, it is asking to be understood. And whether that understanding comes in the form of reconstruction or restraint, one truth remains unchanged. The price was always there. It just took fire to make it visible.